Alright, Abby Shapiro. A lot of you know her as Ben's opera singing sister, who has been churning out the hashtag conservative influencer content on her YouTube channel, which tends to be a tad aggressive with its promotion strategies. Now all this kind of prompted a feeding frenzy of sorts of people reacting to her and her traditional conservative takes. Now I could sit here and smugly make a 10-minute video dunking on something obviously stupid like her opinions about Harry Styles wearing a dress.
Men don't belong in dresses. In Western culture, it's not a thing. Men don't belong in dresses because men should be men. It's a good thing for men to be men, not to be the worst version of men, but to be good, strong, capable men. Women want men who are going to protect them, and that protective instinct is a masculine thing. Women want men who want to support them. That's a wonderful masculine trait. Men in dresses? Not so much.
Now I think it's pretty obvious that what a dude wears probably doesn't have much bearing on whether they can protect or provide for their family. It's not like the fabric is gonna suddenly shrink his muscles. So a progressive person who sees themselves as reasonable might hear what she has to say and think in terms of, what are these vague empty platitudes about men being men? I mean, men also used to hunt for food and shit in the woods. Why does she care about what some dude wears? Why are right-wingers so damn irrational? However, even though she wasn't entirely forthright about it, I think Abby actually has some interesting reasons as to why she thinks Harry wearing that dress is bad. And they're not necessarily stupid reasons, but I'll get to that a little later on. I wasn't that interested in making a whole big response to that video. A video I was much more interested in was this. 6 tips to get through to liberals. It is not easy to bridge the gap. I've always been really interested in the differences between people, how to communicate with each other better, how to bridge gaps, and I was genuinely curious to see from Abby's conservative point of view how she'd attempt to reach out to liberals, because I think that would give me a better, more rounded understanding about the issues at play and also about how someone like her thinks about the opposite side. Okay, so for the first half of this video, I'm going to be focusing on what she says about reaching liberals, and in the second half I'm going to be using her statements as a backdrop with which to talk about conservative ideology more generally, how and why they come to believe the things they do. So Abby starts off by describing the lessons she learned from a book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, and how it illuminated to her the way to approach conversations with people you disagree with politically. Funnily enough, the book has actually been recommended to me a few times, even in my own comments section, but unfortunately I haven't gotten around to reading it. So Abby begins with a very kumbaya attitude, stressing that we should view each other as fully fleshed out, complicated human beings, and bemoaning the fact that people are quick to stereotype and pigeonhole those they disagree with.
There were also some really valuable lessons in the book that I think were worth talking about and will allow us to view people on the other side of the aisle as people and not as enemies. And I think that that's just a really hard thing in American politics today, is that really often across the aisle we view each other not as humans, but just as someone who disagrees with me. We see them as their politics, and people are so much more than that. So even though conservatives and liberals disagree on a lot, we are all people, and it's worth trying to understand the other side.
Honestly, she had several moments where she was intelligent and reasonable, and I found myself completely agreeing with what she said.
Just because someone is born with a certain disposition, that doesn't make them predestined to be left-wing or right-wing. Honestly, people just aren't that simple and aren't that shallow. A good example is if you have actually been convinced of an idea that doesn't seem natural to your personality, you can successfully live a lifestyle that doesn't fit with who you are, in a sense.
And it really felt like she was making a good faith effort to try and bridge gaps, to narrow the political divides that exist. For example, she highlights that some empathy is a key ingredient to and goes a long way to help change someone's mind. Frankly, there generally isn't much value in trying to dunk on other people.
One is to make people feel understood before trying to change their mind. We as humans have the capability to justify all of our feelings because we have both logic and intuition. So if you're having a discussion with someone on the other side of the aisle and you are making logical arguments, you need to understand that they're probably asking themselves, must I believe this? Unless you have proven your point without a doubt and also made sure that the elephant feels comfortable changing gears, you won't have changed the other person's mind. So it's important to do both.
Yeah, that's completely true, and it's something that most of us can try and incorporate more in our lives. Now, interestingly, Abby goes so far as to say that she personally felt condescended towards and stereotyped by the author of the book.
Now, there were things about this book that I didn't love because Jonathan Haidt is a liberal and he was writing this book for liberals so that they could try and understand conservatives. But in doing so, he ended up being a little bit condescending to conservatives and sort of stereotyping our morals and our values.
Now, despite saying all this, she then goes on to broadly stereotype and be condescending towards leftists and so-called wokeists, who she basically describes as less than human. She portrays them as rabid animals, set on destroying society.
I want to get out of the way here and now the difference between leftists and wokeists on one hand and liberals on the other. Leftists live out their woke ideology as religion. They want to tear down our existing moral structures and society and start over from the beginning. They believe that all of the things that we now accept, things that are common sense, things that define morality, define right and wrong, define our social structure, all of that was created during a time when there was too much anything, too much bias, racism, any ism.
Homophobia racism, Islamophobia, deadbeat-ism,
to have any value or legitimacy or moral authority. For the woke, for leftists, they believe that they are the only ones who know what true morality is and that we need to tear everything down and start over.
Now think about that.
From their words and actions, it is very clear that they believe they are smart enough to tear down everything that we have known.
I just want to quickly pause her rant about these evil people and just say it's worth noting that she hasn't mentioned what sort of actions these people actually take or even who they really are. Just that they're, woke and stuff. Now keep that in mind going forward. Now back to the rant.
And start it over with their woke ideology. And anything that is not their woke ideology is immoral, wrong, evil, bad. We need to get rid of it and start from scratch using their version of morality.
So clearly that happy-go-lucky, we're all complicated human beings attitude didn't extend very far. Of course, I personally believe that there are some individuals who you'd never be able to reach through reason or logic because they're so entrenched in their positions or whatever. But broadly speaking, I still believe that whatever group you might think of as super ideological and crazy and unreasonable, there will be some not insignificant number of people who you can have fruitful discussions with. And I just think it's kind of unfortunate that she felt it necessary to cut such a large number of people right from the get-go and basically brand them as amoral, evil thugs.
We can't really negotiate or have a fruitful conversation with leftists and wokists because we're starting on entirely different footing. It honestly doesn't make any sense to engage in conversation with someone who doesn't have common ground with us, because they don't look at how can we make things better from here. They think we need to tear it down and start over.
So Abby stresses the fact that there's a difference between leftists/wokists and liberals in her eyes, but she never highlights what those differences might be. She gives no indication of where she draws the line between the two, only that one of these groups are insane and the other one not so much. I thought this might be about capitalists versus anti-capitalists, but all she said is that this crazy group of people complain about the isms too much, racism, etc. Which, liberals complain about that stuff too. Hell, even some conservatives do. So there's no talk of any specific policy, no mention of any politicians to use as like a reference point or an example of someone who embodies the ideology she's talking about. No specific actions, behaviors. It's all just very vague. When she says that there's a group of people on the left who are too crazy and woke to talk to, well, how are the people in her audience supposed to distinguish a non-crazy liberal from that person? How are they meant to figure out who they're okay to engage with?
The reason that liberals don't give conservatives the benefit of the doubt is because they truly do not understand the way that we think. They don't understand that conservatives are really trying to bring about more happiness in society by encouraging society to be a community built on values that are accurate about human nature and moral virtue, and which have rules that are the proper balance of humility and aspiration. And the reason liberals don't understand this is because they're weird. They view everyone as individuals. They do not see the communal binds that make people happier. And in doing so, in breaking people apart into individuals, they are making people lonelier and sadder because they don't see what the connections actually bring. They believe that personal freedom in every moment is the highest possible good. And they have forgot that in the pursuit of liberty in this sense, they have actually made people sadder and more alone and deprived them of the duties and obligations that give people meaning.
Okay, there's a couple of phrases she uses there, such as accurate about human nature, and about how liberals deprive people of the duties and obligations that give them meaning. I want to talk about those a little later, but first I want to focus on this concept of individuality and communal binds she talks about. So unless she's saying that a hell of a lot of conservatives are actually liberals, I don't agree with what she said, even though there might be a hint of truth to it. So what she's saying sounds kind of right at a gut level, right? Because yeah, to some extent, people in rural areas, people that tend to lean conservative, seems that they do care more about like having a close-knit family, about engaging with the local community, about having a strong social fabric where everyone pulls together. But they also have plenty of other beliefs that are kind of contradictory. And certainly in terms of actual policy, they stress the importance of the individual just as much, if not a lot more, than liberals. Who are the people that generally opposed mask mandates or even the concept of masks as a symbol, risking the safety of the wider community for the sake of this idea of individual freedoms? That was genuinely something everyone could have pulled together with like the sense of communal goodwill, but they didn't like that. Who are the ones that really big up this idea of not succumbing to the tyranny of the many, to state authority? Who champions private enterprise to provide social needs like healthcare or lower taxes? These are individualistic ideals and generally what you find amongst conservatives. I remember watching a video with Jordan Peterson, the conservative, blubbering and crying about the importance of the individual.
A close reading of 20th century history indicates, as nothing else can, the horrors that accompany loss of faith in the idea of the individual. It is only the individual, after all, who suffers. Thus, the reality of the individual must be regarded as primary. Without such regard, there can be no motivation to reduce suffering and therefore no respite. Instead, the production of individual suffering can and has and will be again rationalized and justified for its supposed benefits for the future and the group.
Based in lobster pilled.
So she hasn't actually demonstrated how a conservative ideology lends itself to a more happy, community-oriented society. Basically, her labeling, the way she attributes qualities to certain groups, leaves a lot to be desired. I'm not saying she's necessarily wrong, it's just she seems hesitant to give specific practical examples of how ideologies manifest in and influence real behavior in real life. And I think the reason she operates with this ambiguity is to simply talk down to people she disagrees with in a backhanded way, without having to actually put her neck out. You might think I'm stretching when I say that, so I implore you, have a listen to this little spiel she goes on here.
Concentrate, try not to fall asleep, and try to think of it in terms of, I'm someone who wants to learn how to reach people I disagree with politically. Let's see what lessons or useful information you can glean.
So what Jonathan Haidt is talking about here is how people in the West and weird people are people who only look at morality on one dimension, which is harm and fairness. They don't think that morality contains any other dimensions. It's just harm and fairness. But most people from other parts of the world think that morality has many different spectrums. Western liberals analyze morality based on the individual alone and not in the context of communities or social obligations. Conservatives, though, they view morality as the sum of many parts. They see that there's more to morality than just harm and fairness. What this means for conservatives who have a more holistic view of morality is that we have to show liberals that the other parts of morality do fall under the umbrella of harm and fairness. Jonathan Haidt actually doesn't say this in his book, but I think it's really important, and I think it's something he almost missed in the book. He says that there are 6 foundations of morality. He says there's the care-harm foundation, the fair-exchange foundation, loyalty betrayal foundation, authority subversion foundation, sanctity and degradation foundation, and the liberty oppression foundation. I would argue that all of these principles of morality are actually also part of the care-harm foundation. And this is something that is super important to liberals because it's the only thing that they see is moral. That's the only part of morality that generally matters to them. So if that's the only one that matters to them, showing them how the 5 other principles of morality do actually deal with harm and fairness and deal with care and harm is something that can change the game when you're having a conversation with them. We just need to show that there is a deeper, broader, and more meaningful understanding of what care and harm actually means. And if you can present the other 5 principles of morality as also being about care and harm to a liberal that is weird, then you can actually change their mind because you would be speaking their language.
I don't know if anyone else got this impression, but there doesn't seem to be any actionable information to anything she just said. How does that help with having a discussion with someone you disagree with? How often when you're having those conversations are you talking about spectrums of morality, where you can be like, hey dude, you're just not considering this moral framework, my guy. No one speaks like this, it doesn't get to that stage. And even if it did, again, she doesn't clearly define any of these terms and spectrums or whatever. Like, even for the conservatives listening, all they hear is, oh, liberals have a solely care and harm view of the world. Ah yes, now the next steps are clear. Like, the thesis of this video is trying to help you have a productive conversation with a liberal. I don't know how this helps anyone unless you have really intimate knowledge about the things she's talking about or the book she's getting these concepts from.
You guys may not see the talking down angle that I've been harping on about, but I think by now there's plenty of evidence for it.
Liberals don't understand conservative ideology the way that conservatives understand liberal ideology. The reason that liberals don't give conservatives the benefit of the doubt is because they truly do not understand the way that we think. Conservatives, though, they view morality as the sum of many parts. They see that there's more to morality than just harm and fairness. What this means for conservatives who have a more holistic view of morality is that we have to show liberals.
I think you guys probably see what I'm doing here. We can understand them, but they can't understand us. They just can't see things the way that we do. See, we're sipping from that more holistic, complicated moral well. The reason disagreements exist is because they are blinded. It's up to us to show them the light of our ways. Now, how do you actually approach that conversation? Oh, care, harm, something. See, this isn't about understanding others better or even facilitating better conversations. This is about posing as a missionary.
See, I wouldn't mind stereotyping or assuming how other people think about stuff, if only she gave, clear, practical examples of how that plays out in their beliefs or policy prescriptions. How do they actually think, and how does that play out in the real world? Or at least realistically describe how to approach different people, which is what I'm going to do in my next segment.
For conservatives, it's really important to uphold the tenets that support a strong social fabric, or what they believe to be a strong social fabric. See, everyone has a role to play in order to maintain a harmonious society. These roles are outlined in their mind naturally. Think about the phrases like men are supposed to be men, or marriage is between a man and a woman. Now, to be honest, this is a way of thinking that I somewhat had in my younger years.
It goes something like, nature determines that our role is to survive, to reproduce, propagate the species. Well, it's obvious, isn't it? It's self-evident, really. Women exist to birth a child, men exist to protect and provide. See, it all fits into place, it's all just natural. And you can use this line of thinking to even explain other norms like,
The fact that it's widely accepted that men are more likely to have a more casual approach to sex, or that they're the pursuer or the one who initiates, because the man's natural urge is to try and spread his seed as far as he can.
Whereas for women, well, their natural urge is to be a little bit more selective. Because, hey, they have to find a good partner who's willing to stick around to provide and protect while they raise the children. You can't have that if you're a promiscuous woman. You can get into accepting these really simple, self-contained narratives that perpetuate the current norms.
The thing that sort of changed it for me was this realization that everything we do is kind of as natural or as unnatural as we'd like it to be. I don't think there's a binary nature on-off switch to our behavior. If we accept that we are natural beings, then if there are behaviors we tend to exhibit, then it's as natural as anything else. Like, was it natural for cavemen to make fires? Is it natural for us to cook or farm or wear clothes or use an iPad? Hell if I know.
Hey, it's almost like the behaviors we exhibit are natural only in so much as that is what the environment around us allowed and/or encouraged. Therefore, it's probably a lot more malleable than we assume. I mean, there's nothing written in nature that we ought to reproduce. I wouldn't say you're worth any less as a human because you choose not to have children, right?
I think separating behaviors into natural and unnatural and placing moral weight to it in that sense is kind of silly.
I should say this is mostly for more complicated behaviors that are related to and intertwined with culture, social interaction, knowledge, that kind of thing. Obviously, there are some rudimentary physiological and instinctive behaviors that I would say is probably largely natural or built into us. Like, having an elevated heart rate or jumping when frightened. Basically, my point is, for me personally, appealing to nature has no bearing on whether or not a behavior is good, on whether or not we ought to encourage or discourage it. If you start to wonder whether or not it's natural for some group of people to behave in a certain way, I think you're kind of asking the wrong question if you want to determine if they should be engaging in that behavior. Conservatives think that certain groups of people ought to behave in distinct kinds of ways because that is what they are naturally predisposed to be, and it facilitates the smooth running of society.
Defying that line is to weaken our communal bonds. But personally, underpinning all that, what I think is actually happening is that they feel that they are losing some sort of personal position of security within society. You don't see too many LGBT conservatives for a reason. For a conservative, in a society where a man starts to wear a dress, well, they're no longer sure where exactly they fit. And that brings about an insecurity, which is why Abby and her brother were so displeased about the Harry Styles thing. If some celebrity dude wears a dress, does it really markedly change anything? Does it mean you have to pay more taxes or move us closer to armed conflict or anything? No, of course not. But that's not really what's important.
See, Harry is not playing his role. He doesn't embody what a man ought to be. When I can signify to the world that I know what a man is, and I can understand my place through that anchor, it makes me feel good. But if that definition starts changing, well then where does that leave me? Our sense of social cohesion is being undone. We must all be able to agree and signify to each other what a man or a woman should be. What behaviors are good, bad, cringe, that we're all on the same team pulling together. Just, in the direction that I'm comfortable with. So he has to be wrong. This is inaccurate to human nature.
Built on values that are accurate about human nature and moral virtue.
Okay, now, although not everyone on the left thinks this way, as a left-leaning person, I thought I'd give a personal example that demonstrates how I come to believe the things I do. So about, 10, 12 years ago, I wasn't homophobic. I had no issue with gay people. And here comes the but. But I did hold the belief that a straight couple should be preferred when choosing parents for adoption. Now, this belief was driven mostly through my childhood experiences. I thought you needed both a mother and a father to have the best chance of a good childhood. Because in my head, mothers and fathers had inherently different characteristics, and you needed that balance. Well, there was a friend of mine who disagreed, and he sent me a bunch of studies basically just showing me that children adopted by a same-sex couple fared just as well, if not better. The evidence was overwhelming, and even though it conflicted with my personal experience, my intuition, I eventually accepted it. There's no justifiable reason for my belief. And that put me down a path of not just accepting that, but questioning a lot of my assumptions about gender roles and stuff like that. Traditional conservatives, however, tend to view things differently. To be fair to Abby, I think there is a different moral framework at play. What I do think is true is that for a lot of conservatives, not all, they don't place ultimate value on real practical results. The outcome of your decisions, of your behaviors, is not always what's most important. And the perfect example to demonstrate this is with the issue of abortion. Let's grant this, okay? Even if Let's say making abortion illegal decreases the number of abortions and increase the proportion of babies that are carried to term, which right now I think is a bit of an if. The data I've come across is a bit inconclusive, but let's grant that is the case. Even with that, the outcomes are still largely way more negative, and it certainly seems to come nowhere near stopping the vast majority of abortion. So for instance, women who are denied abortion are consistently worse off in the long run than women who are allowed them. This includes having more serious health complications, more anxiety, a higher likelihood of continued violence, greater poverty, just to name a few. It's not just the women, also the child's faces similarly worse outcomes. When you compare women who have had abortions denied versus women who had received abortions but who then chose to have a child later in life. And this is before mentioning something I think that is now widely accepted, which is that the biggest impact of criminalizing abortion is to simply drive women to have dangerous procedures because of a lack of access to quality healthcare. Despite all that, there are conservatives who believe that abortion should be illegal under any circumstance. Again, I am stereotyping, so not all, but a conservative might see some societal imbalance, and they don't think, what steps should we take to rectify that imbalance in a practical way?
And by that I mean, what does the real evidence show will lead to better outcomes? So right now, it seems like the best way to prevent people from having abortions is quality, comprehensive sexual education and easy access to birth control.
However, for a conservative, that doesn't matter as much as the fact that there are people doing bad things. That is what they'd like to target. Policies that aim to mitigate harm are besides the point. Abortion is immoral in their minds, right? Ideally, people shouldn't be getting them. Well, then the solution is simple. People just should not be doing that bad thing. And if they do, then they were wrong enough to do it. They weren't trying hard enough not to. Then of course, they ought to be punished.
It is a punitive mindset. It's what gets a crowd cheering when Trump talks about handling criminals with excessive force.
And when you see these thugs being thrown into the back of a paddy wagon, you just see them thrown in, rough. I said, please don't be too nice. Like when you guys put somebody in the car and you're protecting their head, you know, the way you put their hand over. I said, you can take the hand away, okay?
The thing is, it's not necessarily stupid, which is the mistake a lot of people on the left make, is automatically attributing these beliefs to stupidity. Like, I don't think all these people have a low intelligence, or they can't do maths, or have a low IQ. They just have a moral value system where those measurable outcomes just aren't the most important thing. And I think if you can find a conservative where it is the most important thing, that's a person you can change the mind of. Because again, they aren't a monolith. The people I've described are like a subsection, and there absolutely are people that you can have fruitful, positive discussions with.
Oh, it also has to be someone who you're able to convince that we're not all just slaves to some unchanging human nature.
If they can't be convinced of that, then I simply think there are fundamental differences that cannot be bridged in a reasonable time frame, let's say. Given that it's a big part of conservative ideology and Abby's video, it would be remiss of me not to talk about religion. I think it's interesting what Abby said about leftist ideology often being treated like a religion. See, the implication here, as I interpret it, is that she meant that as a bad thing, right? That these people believe in something dogmatic and unreasonable simply because it makes them feel good, gives them purpose, guides their life, whatever you want to call it. And the obvious question I'd then ask is, why is that any different than believing in a quote-unquote real religion? Why is their belief any less valid than yours?
True happiness only comes from the feeling of being part of something greater. That's why you have leftists and wokeists treating that philosophy as a religion, because it feels like they're a part of something greater than themselves. When you don't have real religion, you make one up. But what's fascinating is that religion actually binds people together and has done so for thousands of years. And so for people who are participating in religion, it brings them joy, it brings them happiness, and it's super important to creating communities, creating good behavior among societies. It's really important.
Sure, that's true. It can have a binding force, but I think she kind of dulls her own point. According to her, these leftists that treat their ideology as religion, that probably binds them together as well. She admits it probably makes them feel like they're part of something bigger. A lot of things can bind people together, but just because something might have a binding force, that alone in and of itself doesn't necessarily make it a good thing, especially if it leads you to some bad conclusions. Also, oftentimes, a lot of these binding forces may bind the people that already exist within their belief system, but for other people, I think it's fair to say that it can also be pretty exclusionary.
Also, I think she misunderstands. An atheist holds disdain towards religion, not because people believing in it can bind people together, but because it doesn't have a factual basis.
Being able to show why, from a societal perspective, religion is a good thing and not a bad thing, is going to be a really good talking point with liberals.
Sure, if you're able to actually adequately demonstrate that, which thus far, I'm sorry to say, I don't think she has, at least not nearly well enough to convince a godless liberal.
All the positives she lists about religion, you can find in any other ideology or replacement religions.
And that's even working under the assumption that you need some sort of replacement religion, which I'm not entirely convinced of.
When talking about weird liberals, she says that they deprive people of the duties and obligations that give people meaning in life. So what is her prescription for this issue? Should we just force religion down people's throats, even if they don't believe in God? Should facts then not matter? Should we put that aside because collectively believing in this fantasy is more fun? Or I shouldn't dismiss it that way. Let's say it makes for a better society. Maybe she believes that.
And honestly, I think you can reasonably believe that. It might be true. Maybe everyone should take the Matrix blue pill.
But then you have to admit to that facts aren't really that important to you.
There's also an implication throughout our video that being religious instills in you some sort of higher level moral compass.
Religion has encouraged people to be trustworthy and do the right thing in the eyes of God and in the eyes of each other.
Listen, fuck the eyes of God. If you happen to believe in a God, that's fine. I know plenty of intelligent people that do. But I don't like the implication that that's the only way you can be a good person, or that believing in a God gives you a reason to be a good person. I like the idea that people are nice to each other because we are social creatures with empathy, who believe in reciprocation, and who realize that a generally better, fairer society is the best for everyone's interest, including their own. In a way, that is quite a religious ideology too, because I place my faith. I believe in the human capacity to work together, to show compassion, and to grow and learn. See, I like that a lot more than trying to interpret morality from some book, or not doing bad things because it might make the eye of Sauron unhappy or whatever.
Okay, a couple of closing thoughts. I think it's interesting that as time and views progress, conservatives can move on from specific policy prescriptions and forget about them. Gay marriage, contraceptive mandates, opposition to these policies have and will continue to lower. But the underlying tradcon mental process will remain, manifested in different ways. And it's because they don't want to lose their grip on the world. They've anchored themselves in a spot on the planet where they feel comfortable and safe. And if things begin moving on from there, everything might go spiraling out of control. This is why every little thing that you think might be insignificant becomes a battleground. It's why saying happy holidays caused hysteria and claims of liberals waging war on Christmas. I laud Abby's attempt to convey the sentiment that, yeah, we're all fleshed out human beings, and that we need to try and bridge divides even if it's difficult, even if it won't work in all cases. It's a worthwhile thing to try. And you shouldn't try and trick or bully people. You should actually listen to them and really understand. It takes time and it's hard, but it's worth it in my opinion. And frankly, a lot of you really don't have much of a choice. A lot of the world seems to be getting increasingly divided in the last few years. People do need to start coming together a little bit now, I think. Okay, yada yada, empathy is good. These are all just my theories, my observations mostly. And all sorts of people from all sorts of ideologies will exhibit aspects of what I've talked about here. So this isn't just like a conservatives are bad and stupid and everyone else isn't kind of video, even though it may have seemed like it at parts. Alright, anyway, I'm done. See you next time. Peace.